Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Blake Tablak. Blake is the CEO of Trax Technologies, a company that provides transportation spend management visibility for freight audit and payment solutions. With data being at the heart of everything procurement is looking to achieve today, his perspectives on data and risk will absolutely be valuable to this audience. So, hi, Blake. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Hey, Kelly. How's it going?
It is going great. And I think we're going to learn some interesting things today. So in my intro, I talked about where you work and what the company does, but can you give us a little bit more context by talking about sort of your overall background and professional journey?
Yeah, no problem. So I started on the other side of the table, funny enough. So I spent most of my life in revenue. And one of the things revenue teaches you is especially when you're in sort of large, complex transactions, is understanding the core needs of the business is the number one thing you have to figure out. So there is a misconception that or maybe it's not. I don't know. Maybe some of my peers were a bit slimy, but that there's a slimy group of people that are trying to convince you to buy something you don't need.
Yeah.
Most of the time in an enterprise, the number one thing you have to understand is, what is the CEO asking the team to do, and how does that roll down to people's, compensation plans, and what problems are they having getting there? And if you can help them with those problems, great. And if you can't, then, you can't. And that's really it. And I think that's been wildly helpful for me as I think about my professional journey, because any role that I've been in, including the current one, really centers around customer needs and customer problems. And if we can solve them, great. And if we can't, let's be honest about it and part kindly, shake hands and move on. But I think that's a big part of it.
I do think that's an interesting perspective. And I will say, even for procurement, supply chain, sourcing professionals who are the majority of the listeners to this show, we all have internal customers too.
Oh, yeah.
And so while it's not necessarily captured in terms of revenue, there are always metrics, KPIs, business objectives that whoever your customer, in air quotes, happens to be, if you can figure out what matters most to them and figure out if you can move the needle on that, then you can very quickly decide if there's something sort of mutually beneficial to be achieved there.
Yeah, I'll tell you, just to add to this comment, I've noticed a lot of companies that I've worked at in the past, if I were to talk to individual contributors, they couldn't tell me what the CEO goals were. And I wasn't the CEO, I want to be really clear. But I have kept that in my back pocket for a long time. I think, I would always encourage individual contributors or anybody, managers, leaders, know what your CEO is talking about, because it's probably going to end up on your comp plan at some point. And
absolutely,
you're going to want to know how to help get there. So.
Yeah. Now, speaking of big, important things, you specialize in helping companies support big, and a lot of times with big, you get expensive decisions. And it seems like everything today comes down to large data sets. But when we talk about large data sets, whether it's in the context of analysis or something related to AI, the word large has sort of lost any meaning or context. Can you just give us some sense of the scope associated with what we might otherwise flippantly refer to as a large data set?
Yeah, it is funny, right? We used to think of large as Jupiter, and now we're looking at the universe, right?
Yes.
And it's really that context of well, we have a lot of data. We as a business have about 18 terabytes of information about global supply chains over 20 years. So you're talking a huge data set. I remember when hard drives were just a couple of megabytes or a megabyte, right? And so now we're talking, I have 18 terabytes of data. And so that's the scale you're talking about. I mean, it wouldn't be, I think one of the number one expenses for cloud is storage. So every company has volumes and volumes of data. And I think that's the scale you're talking about. When you think about our business specifically, we deal with companies at the smallest end. We deal with sort of more complex global companies. So at the smallest end, you're talking $250 million worth of annualized spend. At the high end, you're looking, $4 to $10 billion in annualized spend, where an invoice could be for a couple $100 or $1,000, right? So the volume of data coming in, and each invoice has, you know, any number of elements into it, and then you have contractual elements that we're comparing and matching to. The volume starts to scale fairly quickly, as you can imagine. So
Yeah. And yet with that scale, you do also get sort of a loss of control. You know, back in the olden days when our data equivalent was like these 4 rocks, and I can hold these 4 rocks, or I can put them next to my feet and I
right,
can look at them and I know how big they are and I know exactly where they are at any given time. Now we're managing sort of the beach, but it's
yeah,
all these grains of sand that you can't hold in your hands. And so companies have this issue that either they have a ton of data and they don't trust it, or the
yeah,
people that they're working with around the data don't trust it, or they may have this nagging sense that as much as they have, they still don't have it all. And if
yeah,
they're aware of that missing piece, it could be sort of the key differentiator in a decision.
yeah.
What are you seeing and hearing about overall data confidence right now?
Yeah. Okay. So I find this to be a fascinating subject overall. One, data governance is a very big thing that people are talking about now. And if you hear this over and over and over again, you go, and you sort of tune it out. I'll give you some really specific things. How much do we actually want to store? Right. This is a question
Yeah.
that I think more and more people are starting to ask because of the expense. The way to figure out how much is to figure out what you're going to do with it. Right. Just storing everything and then we'll figure out what to do with it later. Really bad plan, because ultimately then you're going to store a bunch of stuff that you haven't normalized or that you don't understand what the end context is. So what does it need to look like at the end? Figure out what the end goal is. From a procurement perspective, just look at all the levers that you can pull in an agreement,
Mhm.
right, that have some sort of variable metric to them. So days payable, right, net payment terms is a really good one. Everybody kind of calls it something different in a contract. Sometimes just say you have, these are your payment terms, what have you. Normalize that data and start looking at it across different, if you're in supply chain, different lanes, different
Yeah.
carriers, things like that, right? Then augment that data. So go find a third party source that you can bring in a little bit more. What you're trying to figure out in a case like that is how far away from the mean or the average am I? By the way, in the case of things like net payable terms or days payable, if you're way below, you're leaving cash on the table. If you're way
Yeah.
above, you may be getting subpar performance, which may be hurting revenue in other lines that you aren't aware of. So when I think about the outcome of something or the data I want to store, it's the outcome. I don't want it all. It's worthless and will just muddy the waters. But what are the outcomes I want? And then start storing that data. The fallacy of we're going to store it all and then we'll figure out what to do with it later.
Yeah.
There are so many examples of you end up storing data, you haven't normalized it. In supply chain, there's something called accessorial costs. And if you're just storing all these different codes and you say later on, well, I want to figure out what fuel surcharges are, you have 18,000 different codes from carriers. You haven't normalized the data, and so
Yeah.
therefore nobody trusts it. And you go, well, why did we store it, spend all that money, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, and it's interesting too that you talk about, looking towards outcomes. So you have all of this data, you hopefully have trust. You're going to use that data, hopefully,
Mhm.
for something. And it's interesting because procurement is often in a position of doing the analysis or gathering the data, even benchmarking against third parties, but not making the ultimate decision.
Yep.
And so a lot of times the challenge ends up becoming that context that
Yeah.
you can run all the most complicated formulas at the world. At the end of the day, on a spreadsheet, you have the number 12,
That's
right?
right.
Is
Yeah.
12 good? Is 12 bad? To your example about days
Yeah.
payment outstanding, is it helping us? Is it hurting us? That's sort of the real challenge. It takes so much effort and energy to gather that data, cleanse and normalize, analyze, and yet you're only halfway there if
Right.
you don't put it in context.
That's right. So this is fascinating for me. Decision making. We have a framework we use internally. So on the up and down axis is sort of the scope of the outcome. So it can either be really good or really bad, right? Depending on which way you go. So think about it as like risk. If I land on the blue properties in Monopoly with a hotel on it, I'm done. Like this is a huge problem, right? But if I'm the guy that owns the hotel, I have just raked it in. So that's sort of the top. The bottom would be like Mediterranean Avenue. You just pay it and move on. Okay? That's your left side. Now, the elements that make up the decision are data, experience. The remainder is risk. So the unknown is what's risky. So that 12 that sits there on that spreadsheet, don't leave your experience at the door, right? Oftentimes we'll see a 12 and we will instinctively know, 15 would be better. Or it seems really good because 11 is sort of what I normally see, assuming more is better, right? That is an area where I think a lot of people leave that behind, and they leave their experience behind. They don't feel, well, I don't know if my opinion matters. It does. Trust me. When I'm working with our procurement and we're acquiring things, I want your opinion. I want to know what you've seen. And if you don't have one because you don't have the experience, go find somebody who does. Right? Call a friend, call a peer. Hey, what do you think? Right?
Yeah.
Because those two pieces together can really de-risk decisions. Data and experience, those two things go together, right?
Well, and I'll say, Blake, you've just officially endeared yourself to everyone in the audience. Blake wants procurement opinions. Everybody pile the love on Blake as you listen to this episode.
Yeah.
But to your point about decision making and having an opinion, eventually we have to leave the realm of data and analysis and get to the people part where choices are being made and discussions are being had. Yeah. And so necessarily we come crashing into company culture. Yeah. And if we stay with our example of 12, it could be, okay, usually I have 11, right? Like you said, but 12's not enough better in this company culture for me to trumpet that. So I'm just going to stick it in my drawer and hopefully next month I'll have 16. Yeah. Or it could be, hey, every incremental improvement is a celebration. It could also be you were aiming for 12 and got 3, but you're able to say, the reason we got 3 is, and so we're going to start doing this or stop doing that. And that failure in a way, or that learning is celebrated.
That's right.
How have you seen company culture play a role in terms of people making decisions around even what data to share, let alone how they make decisions based upon it?
Yeah. Okay. Again, this one's pretty near and dear to my heart. Failure and success are two sides of the same coin every time. And so how you treat failure and how you treat success, both of those will dictate how fast and how far you can go. As a CEO, we have an analogy here. It's called the branches analogy, right? At the trunk, the branch is quite thick. And so when you're doing things that you've done over and over and over again, you should get them right. We have an expectation that if we have a policy, you're going to follow it. Okay. If you fail to follow the policy and it goes poorly, right, then that's a self-inflicted wound. We're right near the trunk. We should never have those problems. You're going to, okay? But you should never have those problems. As you get further out on the branch gets a wee bit thinner, or more brittle, and chances are you're going to fall off. That branch is going to break every once in a while. So we had a scenario recently where we had a very big project that was coming to fruition with a very big customer, and 98% of it went great. The 2% that didn't go great, we caught, would have been a meaningful problem had we not caught it. Now we caught it, okay? And by the way, it was still problematic, just to be fair.
Sure.
We told the customer about it. They didn't find out about it. We told them, okay? And internally, we celebrated it. It was a really big project that had one significant error. I'll take it all day long, right?
Yeah.
And we celebrated it. We celebrated on a town hall. We celebrated how we responded to it, all those kinds of things. And I think that's the culture you need to move ahead, okay? When you fail and it's reasonable, embrace it. Okay. Because if you're taking risks, you're going to fail.
Yeah.
When you fail and you're near the trunk, make sure those people understand how devastating those failures are. Okay. Now, that failure, by the way, near the trunk, if you find somebody who's really great at their job and they're constantly great at their job and they make that failure, don't fire them for making that failure. I really don't care how big it is.
Yeah.
The chances of them ever making it again are 0, because they will never, ever, ever forget that moment. So understanding the humanity of a decision as well, I think, is very important. So when you think about that branch, that's how we look at the world. And I think as a company culture, you need to celebrate those things. Incremental gains are great. I will take a 1 gain every month, right? Like the old joke, would you take $1 million today, or would you take $1 million that doubles every day for 30 days? I'm going with B, because now I know the answer, right? But I will take those incremental gains, right? The law of incremental returns, I'll take them all day long. I would prefer a 1 and a 2 versus waiting for a 10. So I think culture is, you have to celebrate the wins and unpack them the same way you unpack and celebrate the failures, and just figure out what a good failure and a bad failure is.
Yeah. And I think investing time and energy into not only that decision-making process, but learning from the choices that are made. The reality is some decisions age better than other decisions. And so
it's very easy to look back in retrospect and say, what on earth were we thinking? But you have to give yourself sort of benefit of the doubt and say,
Correct.
I don't know, but I think it was good.
Yeah.
Is there an opportunity to try to retain some of the, I don't know, thought process or context
Sure.
around a decision so that whether it's hugely successful, an enormous failure, or anywhere in between, you sort of remember what went into making that decision or what alternatives were? How can
Mhm.
we capture that so that the learning process continues?
So I would say two things. One, I really like the Amazon model of discussing problems where you have a one-page write-up. Okay, and if you haven't seen this before, go Google it, and don't even talk about it here. I really like that because it does capture that current state
Yeah.
of how we are thinking about this decision. It doesn't take long to put it together, and it also forces everybody else who's at the table to read it. That you will have time to sort of get through, and so you'll understand the context of the decision. I love history, and I read a lot of very ancient manuscripts, and the context of the time you have to understand when you're reading something old, because if you try and apply current context to old readings, right? So just have that in mind, that instead of we have a big slide in our town halls, and it's a poison symbol, so like crossbones and danger, and it says no armchair quarterbacking. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
that is it. That's not a value we hold dear. Don't look back and assume the people that made the decision were idiots. Assume they're really smart people, and with the best intentions in mind and with the best information available to them and all of their experience, they made a decision, which is better than staying the same. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that. I will tell you, I'll take that all day long. Go unpack it if it fails, figure out why. Chances are it won't fail spectacularly. Some do, but it will fail incrementally, and then you're constantly evolving that until it actually works, right? The light bulb analogy. I know 2,500 ways this thing doesn't work. I think is what
That's right.
says, right? And then now we're all enjoying this great light and these beautiful rings and the whole thing, right? So
Yeah. And that context is important. Your point about ancient manuscripts is well taken. I will sometimes pause. I'm an old movie buff. And so I will sometimes pause while watching a movie and think, this wouldn't work today because the person would just take their cell phone. There'd be no like race across town or race across the state. You would just call ahead and say, hey, I'm running behind. Get in the helicopter without me. I'll figure something out.
Right.
But in that movie, in that time, you have to accept sort of their rules of time and space and communication. And I think that's a good way to look at it, is to always look back and assume, whether it includes you or not, that the people who made that choice did the very best they could in the moment, and leave it at that, because you will never get back to that moment and remember any of the direct or indirect influences on that choice.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. And if you're a leader and you're listening to this, embrace that as part of your value structure, right? The people that work for you are not malicious people. I don't think. I mean, I hope not, right? They're all well-meaning, well-intentioned people. And if you beat them severely for failures, for decisions made years ago, no one's ever going to make a decision. They're just going to be quiet and let failure get at you. Silently.
Now, to that point, I remember from one of my classes in business school, I actually think it was like a combination strategy and marketing class. There was always this fallback for if you hadn't done the reading that week or hadn't quite finished it, that when the professor was asking for, okay, let's list on the board all of the things that this company and their decision makers could have done in this situation, it was always an option to say they could do nothing. That was always sort of the freebie that somebody got to throw out first. But given today's risk appetite, I'm actually wondering if that's something that hasn't necessarily aged as well. Where would you say the doing nothing option, and obviously it's going to be very different based on situation, but generally speaking, where does doing nothing fall on the risk continuum?
Okay, so I'll answer that question first, but I want to add some color. Doing nothing is the riskiest decision you can make. And there's a lot of evidence for it. Go back and look at all of the major brands that existed when you were a kid. And it was something like, I heard some astronomical numbers, some massive percentage of public companies in the Fortune 500 don't even exist today.
Yeah.
And largely because they probably didn't do anything. Digital cameras versus, film. And there are a ton of major camera companies that are just gone. They're history.
Blockbuster. They immediately popped to mind. They had the opportunity to buy Netflix for the equivalent of couch change and didn't.
Didn't do it. And by the way, if they did buy it, they probably would have squandered it. Let's be honest. Like they probably would have screwed it up.
Yeah.
Redbox is another great example.
Right.
I mean, there's so many companies out there that do nothing. And I have come into companies as part of an executive team to help turn something around. And the number one problem was nobody was doing anything. They felt too risky. So on this point, I will tell you, assume that doing nothing is the riskiest decision. The other thing is assess the risk of the decision you are making. If I go buy a pen, okay, I buy a pen and it doesn't work, I'm going to throw it in the garbage. That's not a risky decision.
Yeah.
Right? If I am going to take every penny of my family's money and go invest it in a stock, like that's a wildly risky decision.
Yeah.
Right? Understand the risk of your decisions. Very few of them result in monopoly type scenarios where you go bankrupt and it's all over. Even that one, we're going to invest it all in a stock. If it starts to go down, I'll just take the money out, right? Like,
that's right.
Understand what your outs are and how that risk will play out. Risk assessment is key to decision making, and very few decisions you will make are as risky as you think they are. Okay, almost none of them. But I will tell you, the one that's awful is staying where you are. Yeah. Militaries will tell you, if you're under attack and you're there, move. No matter how scary it is, you have to move. Well, as a business, if you aren't moving and you're under attack, your product is having problems, your competitors are getting a leg up on you, you're dead in 2 years. If you're not under attack, and let's say you're the market leader and you're doing nothing, you're dead in 5 years.
Yeah.
So doing nothing will result assuredly in death, right? That is the worst. It's over at that point. So I would say doing nothing is 100% the riskiest scenario. I will take, and then last comment I'll make here, when you choose to do something, assume it's going to fail in some way, shape, or form, right? Almost all of the stuff that we've done here that's turned our business into the success that it has been over this last year is all of it failed. I mean, all of it started with, we launched it didn't work.
Yeah.
Well, you can go back to square one and say, well, we're not doing that. Or you go, you know what didn't work? Okay, let's change that and try it again. Let's change that and try it again. Let's change that and try it again. And then all of a sudden, our investors in board meetings are saying, we're so proud of you guys. Like, you're doing so well. This is such a great investment for us. I'll take that all day long, right? So very rarely the decisions you will make will they work the first time. Presume they'll fail, and then just keep editing and keep testing and keep editing. And then finally you're going to find some pretty successful things that you'll look back on. Everyone else will tell you they were overnight successes, by the way. Only you will know the great history of the failures, and you'll have a good laugh at it.
Well, Blake, as we start to wrap up our conversation, we have a little exercise here that we always wrap every interview with. I'm going to give you 2 questions. You can pick either one to answer, and I haven't heard a wrong answer yet. So this is the one place I'll actually go against your own rule. This is the one place you can assume you won't fail, because there's no wrong answers here. So your options are, what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or if we think more broadly, what do you think heroism looks like in an overall business context?
Sure. Let me take B, because I think it will apply to A anyway. Yes. So what I will say is heroism looks to me like people who make decisions when it's scary to make the decision. And almost all decisions are scary. There's very rarely something that's so black and white. Sometimes it is. Sometimes your back's against the wall, and if you do nothing, you're going to die. So you might as well go take some massive risk. And really, it's not that risky, right? But most decisions are really gray. Like, you have a bunch of data and you get a bunch of experience, and it doesn't perfectly apply to the situation. So the people who are heroes for me are the ones that make little decisions here and there, and they just keep doing it. They keep pressing forward and they keep pressing forward. And then when they fail, they don't quit. With my kids, one of the things that I try and teach them constantly is that practice is a great place to fail miserably.
Yeah.
My youngest one will cry if he can't catch the ball over and over again. My oldest one, he just keeps at it. My youngest one will get to where my oldest one is, right? So failure is something that is perfectly acceptable and is something that will teach you the right way to go do it. I think those are the heroes. So many people are waiting for someone else to make the decision. We talk about this as authority bias. The 6 people on your ELT, your executive team, they're not going to make the decisions. They will. There's some that they'll make. But the day-to-day stuff, you're going to do. And so heroes for me are people who raise their hand and say, you know what? I didn't like how this was working. I talked to my team. We've come up with a new process. I'd like to move forward with it. Not, can I? Like, I'd like to move forward with it. Or it was kind of not that risky. So we just did it and it worked. It is so imperative for an entire organization to feel that way and to think and move forward. And those are the heroes for me. I celebrate them constantly. We will call people out for their successes and failures and celebrate both of them. I want more people feeling confidence and courage to move forward than feeling terrified and just staying where they are. So there's a lot that's on the line. I get it. We're all paying for our families to eat and go to school and do all those things, and it's a heavy weight to carry. But I carry it with pride. Right? Pressure is a privilege, and make those decisions. Go do it. So.
Well, Blake, this has been an incredibly engaging conversation. I know it gave me a lot to think about. I think there's a whole bunch of things, especially around this idea of sort of celebrating failure and doing something, right? Like try something different that people will be thinking about long after they're done listening. If someone has met you in the process of listening to this conversation, what is the best way for them to reach out, to connect, to learn more about what you do?
So two things. One, you can go to our website, TraxTech, TraxTech.com. If you like, you can come to LinkedIn and you can message me directly, and I will put you in touch with the right person. I'm a reasonably social person, my wife will tell you. I've yet to meet somebody I wasn't up to talking to, so feel free to reach out directly.
Excellent. Well, Blake, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.